make you more attractive. But before you say sign me up, this parasite also does something very scary. I'm most surprised that cordyceps popped off so much for things like The Last of Us, but right now everyone's sleeping on this one. It's called Toxoplasma gondii. And if you get infected by this thing, you might actually get more attractive. So they estimate between 30 and 50% of the population has this parasite. And at a university in Finland, they did studies on it, and it's true. And they see this in humans as well as rats. When they test it, they find that there's subjects that are infected with T. gondii. They are perceived as more intimately attractive than the people or the rats that were not infected. So this can do things like elevate men's testosterone. For women, it can lower their body fat percentage, but it does so much more than that. It hijacks your entire body and you don't even know. And this thing will start releasing chemicals and hijacking your nervous system so it can make you do what it wants you to do, which is to spread it. Talk about how people can transmit this intimately. And we're going to get back to that in a minute because it makes it so much more interesting. But they found that it can manipulate the human host's behavior. It can manipulate chemicals so it can affect your neurotransmitters and your hormones. And it also will make your body release chemicals and you to take on behaviors that actually will make your face more symmetrical. And that's because this parasite has been evolving along with humans throughout our evolution, infecting us generation after generation. So sometimes the things we're doing or the things we think we want, it's not actually us, it could be a parasite. And when they did these small studies, they found that the people who were infected with T. gondii, that they actually did have more facial symmetry, that they had more intimate partners, and they were rated as more attractive. Because of how it manifests, this is probably one of the reasons why the T. gondii parasite has been so successful all throughout our evolution. Because most parasites, they harm the host. And they talk over in study, one thing that diminishes parasite spreading normally is that they do suck out the life and vitality of their hosts, so over time, their health and their attractiveness goes down. This would make it less likely for the person to be around people and to find a mate, so it's less likely the parasite would spread. But that's where T. gondii comes in. It doesn't do this. It actually makes us look more attractive and more desirable, while also upping our intimate desires and drive. And in a lot of studies, they find this, that people who were infected, the men had lower fluctuating facial asymmetry, and the women had a lower body mass index. They as well also had a tendency for lower facial fluctuation and asymmetry, meaning that they were more symmetrical. They actually perceived themselves as being more attractive. And then they would have a higher number of intimate partners. I just want to point out in this one though, they talked about how the women had a higher chance at having intimate partners, but that actually went for both genders. As far as the other studies I've seen, I don't know why they just talked about it for women in this one. And when polled, the infected men and women always would rank as more attractive than their non-infected counterparts. And not just more attractive, healthier looking. So I promise, the cordyceps thing was not clickbait. One of the things that makes cordyceps scary is that they hijack the host's mind and then they take the body over and plant it in a place to where it can have a chance for the fungal infection to fully take over the host, and then it can start to drop its pollen, thereby infecting other members of the group of whatever species it took over. Toxoplasmosis gondii, it does this too, but it doesn't do it in a physical way where there's like mushrooms poking out of their head. But they found when studying rodents that a rodent having T. gondii, that it increased its chances of being preyed on in fields. And when studying this, they found that the mice and rats, they also, when infected, didn't have an aversion to cat urine like they normally would. Typically, when a rodent would smell a feline's urine, it would want to run away because it would sense danger, but the T. gondii would override this. And the rats and mice would show erratic behaviors, and it lowered their anxiety. And so they were more likely to be eaten by felines, because felines play a huge role in this. T. gondii can only intimately reproduce in Felidae, also known as cats. And that's exactly why the mice stop being alerted by the cat's urine, and they'll just hang out in these fields so they're easy pickings. It's because the parasite took over the mouse's brain and it wanted to get into the cat. So we have this wild cycle where we have these infected animals, they have tissue cysts, they're then eaten by the feline, that feline passes on a fecal oocyst, and then that can transmit to humans in a bunch of different ways, either by contaminating the soil and getting on food, or these parasites can get into animals and they can create cysts, which then are not cooked fully, will be eaten by humans, which can then also infect them. So this parasite can affect us whether we are eating vegetables or meat. And then we're not even talking about the transmission between people, which we'll get to in a second. For my hypochondriacs out there, just know that if you wash your fruits and vegetables, cook your meat thoroughly, wash and prep your surfaces. If you're pregnant, do not interact with cat litter. And just in general, you should be wearing a mask and gloves to take out your cat litter and be doing it often. And then working in the soil, you should be wearing gloves and washing your hands. And they found as they were studying T. gondii that these mice that were running into fields no longer afraid of triggers that should have made them run away. Gondii actually induced behavioral changes in the and it did this through epigenetic remodeling. I don't know if people understand how scary this is. This thing can actually rewire our brains. So for most people, getting infected by this is asymptomatic. You won't even know you've gotten it. For some people, you might have flu-like symptoms, but it can be dangerous in people with weakened immune system, infants, because it can cause toxoplasmosis, which can range in symptoms from muscle aches, tender lymph nodes. Weakened immune system, people can get eye problems, some people can even experience seizures. And it talks about how this is associated with a variety of neuropsychiatric and behavioral conditions. And rarely it can be spread by blood transfusions. And T. gondii can infect almost any kind of warm-blooded animal. And so they estimate up to half of the world's population might be infected by T. gondii. While in the United States, it's approximately 11%, but in some countries it's more than 60% are infected with T. gondii. And pregnant women can pass it on to their children. There's actually a lot of studies on it. This one looks into promiscuity when looking at T. gondii. And this first part is all the stuff we've already talked about. But they're finding even asymptomatic infections can have effects on behavior and may be responsible for a vast array of neuropsychiatric symptoms. It can live your entire life in the central nervous system. And it's actually within the neurons, and it's modifying their function as well as the structure so that they can make the changes they want and get the behaviors they want out of the host. They found some connections between T. gondii infections and schizophrenia, some ideations of taking one's own life, anxiety, depression, aggression, even more traffic accidents. But there are some studies that say that there's little evidence of this, except even this study agrees that T. gondii may cause ideation of taking one's own life. Which is kind of interesting because it reminds you of the mouse who suddenly isn't scared of what it's supposed to be scared of. And maybe this is its way of getting back into the soil. Because even though the virus can asexually reproduce inside of most warm-blooded creatures, it still does need something in the cat family so it can sexually reproduce. So T. gondii needs this cycle to keep going. Okay, let's talk about it being transmitted intimately between humans, because there is evidence that brown rats, sheep, and dogs can all transmit it intimately. And that's why they consider felids to be the definitive hosts, and then they consider humans and other mammals to be intermediate hosts. But there's a reason why it's controversial whether or not humans can spread it intimately. So looking over at that last paper's reference, we have a 2014 article seeing if it can be intimately transmitted. And they're suggesting that infected men are passing it to non-infected women during intercourse, and that is giving them potentially congenital toxoplasmosis. So when testing, they found Toxoplasma tachyocytes in the fluid as well as the organ itself. And this was in animals and in humans. And they actually found in artificial insemination in other species with infected males' reproductive fluids, they found that they did in fact infected by the T. gondii. They also talk about how up to 2/3 of Toxoplasma infections in pregnant women cannot be explained by the known risk factors. So they're finding that even when pregnant women are doing all of the things they're supposed to, they're still getting it. They found in women of childbearing age that STDs and STIs directly correlates with toxoplasmosis infections, how toxoplasmosis can trigger schizophrenia in predisposed subjects. And then men show schizophrenia onset 2 to 3 years prior to women showing it. So they're guessing that men are getting it, passing it on to women after a couple years. And so their psychiatric issues because of it show sooner. So when you're looking at this parasite, that will make you look more attractive. Also remember, it comes at the price of it taking over your body and your mind. Because T. gondii just wants us to keep spreading the infection so it can get inside of a cat and reproduce and get dumped out, or it can start all over. There's a parasite that will make you more attractive, but